Well, a very good afternoon, morning, or evening to you, and welcome to this edition of A Reason for Hope. I am Sean Richards, joined by the Burrito to discuss today's Apologetics Monday topic, as well as to receive your questions about the Bible. Note that at the time of this recording, it is Monday, and we are taking that time aside to address a specific issue pertaining to the world religions that are hostile to our own, and to know how to not only respond to these things, but to not be stumbled or caught off guard when these kind of objections are thrown our way. Today's topic will be one that we've discussed previously on Apologetics Monday before. In fact, it was the second topic we discussed on Apologetics Monday at all, but specifically geared towards the atheist audience. We will be discussing how influential the theory of evolution and what they're claiming, as opposed to what it means, what it can mean, and what it actually has going for it and against it, and how significant worldviews really play in all of this are. But before we get into all that, we want to make sure that the purpose of this broadcast, as originally advertised in taking your Bible questions, is still fulfilled. So know that even while our subject today is pretty much dedicated to atheism and evolution, you can still send us your questions, which I will be monitoring as the broadcast unfolds, and we'll be happy to receive and even answer if time allows. First and foremost, we are live streaming on a number of social media platforms. YouTube is A Reason, the number 4 Hope. If you subscribe to us there, hit the notification bell. You can leave your questions in the comments of any video, and we will be happy to address them on the broadcast. Facebook is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, or CCFTUCSON. That will be available both during and after the broadcast, much like YouTube. X, or Twitter, is SCOTTR4H, Scott R4H, or Pastor Scott's Twitter handle will be how you can tweet us your questions, and we will be happy to receive them. And note, we are live streaming there as well. And lastly, our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com. Click on the Watch Live tab. You'll be sent to a page where we are live streaming every single weekday, but only when we're live. If you want to send us your questions after we are live, you can email them to us at questions@areason4hope.org. However you choose to send your questions to us, just make sure that they are questions, that they are sincere, and that, of course, they are pertaining to the Bible, the Christian faith, or anything adjacent. If it is involving other world religions and objections made by those belief systems, odds are they'll probably be addressed here. But we do welcome those as well, as long as God's Word ultimately ends up being the focus of those issues and discussions. And we look forward to seeing what God will do with the time that we give to Him. But before we do any of that and getting into today's topic, we want to, of course, start off in a word of prayer, ask for God to equip us with His heart before representing His Word. So let's do that. God, thank you for the opportunity you've given us to not only be in your Word among your people, but I ask in your Spirit to rightly divide the word of truth, to be able to critically examine those worldviews that are presented as contrary to you when little can be said of them at all. And that as this more recent cult and testimony against your truth is gaining traction in the lives of so many people, my prayer is that at best, this would leave one less excuse for many listening in the audience and get into more relevant conversations like that of your Son. And we pray this in His name. Amen. So, without further ado, evolution is a fact. Evolution is proven true. You Christians are anti-science because you, unless you talk to some every now and again, don't believe in evolution, so on, so on, so on. The main divide between atheists and any other religious group is that they have produced their own creation account, and this has unfortunately gained a monopoly on pop culture, and any view against it has been censored. And Stein did a documentary on it titled Expelled. This is, again, always going to be the case, that when you don't allow for criticism, it's usually because you're hiding something. Yet the story of an extremely specific brand of evolution is promoted, most of the time without evidence, enforced without reason, and equivocated, meaning multiple definitions of the same word are used interchangeably as a manipulation tactic, with other forms of evolution as if it's all talking about the same thing. The reality is that just like saying something as a fact wouldn't make it so, and mocking people for having a different view than you doesn't automatically make them wrong. The reality isn't just saying evolution is a fact proves anything in favor of atheism, any more than saying God exists disproves them. We want evidence. But before getting into conversations actually worth having, we all need to be prepared to deal with the specific place of security, as we often talked about in our previous studies in Islam, that atheists will always fall back on when arguing that science is on their side, and anyone who isn't on their side is anti-science. Examine the claim specifically, and you'll only need to discover one issue in order to prove evolution isn't as solid a fact as it's advertised to be. And from there, you can also figure out the kind of person you're talking to based on the reasons for believing it, so that you don't end up wasting your time with someone who is just projecting their irrationality and performative personality onto everyone who isn't in their cult. And you may think that this is rude and harsh, but the reality is we shouldn't be casting our pearls before swine. And if you can make a distinction between someone who is just part of the clan, who is familiar with these kind of arguments, and ultimately, when shown evidence contrary to their worldview, is going, oh, I didn't know about that, I'll look more into it, as opposed to the person who will just change the topic, resort to foul language or personal attacks. We don't want to be that kind of person. We don't want to talk to that kind of person. And so being able to poke a few holes in this pre-memorized script and worldview will hopefully reveal the kind of person that you can talk to, as opposed to the one that you don't need to. And in order to equip you all for that, we're going to be divvying this up into a series of 6 questions. The 7th will be issues for consideration in regards to this topic. I'll give you a spoiler just so that up front we aren't alienating those among the Christian Brotherhood that do acknowledge the theory of evolution, theistic evolution, or old earth creationist. They, of course, pretty much throw a monkey wrench in this mindset and idea that a belief in God and evolution are completely irreconcilable. Evolution doesn't, of course, find its monopoly in atheism. We personally here at A Reason for Hope don't affirm that, and we'll be happy to address that in individual questions following up. But understand that the topic of today's conversation and the thrust of this point is regarding whether or not evolution, as it's portrayed in the modern day, is an automatic proof and win for atheism contrary to Christianity. So when arguments are made in terms of evolution adjacent or creationist versus old earth and all these other interesting conversations, understand that's not the topic that we're discussing. So bringing it up, unless you want a follow-up question and a follow-up topic, would not be relevant to this conversation and thus won't be acknowledged until it is relevant to future broadcast. So let's be clear on that and hopefully get somewhere meaningful. So let's start with the first question. The first is, when someone brings up that evolution is true, that's just a fact, as if that's supposed to mean something to anybody, the first thing you need to clarify is the dictionary. If we don't agree on language and you can't be held to what you mean by words, then a conversation isn't worth having. Charlie Kirk used this tactic all the time when trying to have meaningful conversations or to make examples of people who weren't sincere and weren't thinking through what they were saying. What do you mean by evolution? Because the word evolution just means change. And while the most recent proponent of it, Charles Darwin, who originally was a heretical pastor who married his cousin and was shocked when God would allow a child born from that union to have a compromised immune system, popularized the theory. His claims in his book on the origin of species through means of natural selection are vastly different from the modern model that is stated, ironically enough, by faith and enforced through censorship and mockery today. And just like Darwin's motivation for looking to his fan fiction, for all intents and purposes, to explain away God, was motivated more by personal problems than the actual data, he made huge errors that are ignored and treated as dogma by atheists today. This isn't necessarily his fault because, understand, he didn't have access to the technology and the ability to examine and test his claims like we do today. An electron microscope might have helped him in his view that a cell is a very simple organism, whereas, as we see today, even a prokaryotic, let alone a eukaryotic organism, is an extremely vast and complicated marvel of engineering, so much so to the point that on top of being used for the fine-tuning argument and what we'll talk about later in irreducible complexity, but the motor functions and the way that these little squigglies tend to move are things that engineers in real life use to reverse engineer our motors and our functions today. Set in modern technology and biomimetics is, again, an entire field of engineering that copies what's already at work in our bodies. And notice, our bodies themselves wouldn't function if all of these intricately complicated things that Darwin was not aware of and that might have fudged some numbers in his original theory weren't there from the very beginning of our existence. He didn't have access to our fossil record that showed his belief that there would be millions upon millions of transitional forms between species when we only have things limited to artwork and fraud in order to actually prove that. And of course, most importantly, he didn't understand that evolution and natural selection aren't the same thing. Mutation, or removing, altering, changing genetic data, produces less function universally. Most significantly, and most relevantly to the propagation of species, the ability to reproduce. Not add information that benefits the organism into an entirely new genus. For example, when you produce a hybrid, lions and tigers, oh my, the liger, a crossbreed between a lion and a tiger, can only be performed within the Panthera genus of the feline species. Speciation also needs to be noted as having never been observed to extend beyond the species. That when we're talking about a transition from a dog to a wolf to a chihuahua to a fill in the blank as far as your breed is concerned, we see diversities within species, but one of the foundational arguments that Darwin assumed was that the dog could transition from a dog to a cat to a frog to a tree to a whatever you want to name. And the emphasis needs to be put forward. Environments certainly influence diversity within the genus, but that's observable. We don't argue against that. But when it comes down to it, the actual arguments need to be based on what's being said and meant, not what's said and what it means can be adjusted based off of what evidence is actually on the table. For example, and this is going to be a long name, but it is worth remembering, the actual version of evolution that's being put forward as religious dogma for atheists is the specific brand of evolution that argues abiogenesis, so apart from biology and our origins, macro, not micro, within the species, but macro, broad evolution through specifically means of natural selection, the survival of the fittest approach and model. The origin, once again, argues from an uncaused effect, life from non-life, which is what abiogenesis is claiming. The purpose that's being driven in this claim is that survival is the end-all be-all, until, of course, you get into human society and suddenly ethics become important. The cause of this is none. It just happened, which is amusing when they claim that this is a scientific process of cause and effect when there was no cause to this. And an example of this would be the mentality of the transition from unconscious slime into conscious and functional organisms like fish, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and avians. There's other theories that, of course, are aware of the fact that abiogenesis, macroevolution through means of natural selection, is by definition unscientific and unobserved. So when you call out some of its weaknesses, then they will change the term into, well, you know, I believe that, and Richard Dawkins, a very famous atheist and proponent of this form of evolution, tried to fall back on in Ben Stein's documentary Expelled, where he argued not for but using the same word and thinking it accomplished the same conclusion. Not abiogenesis, macroevolution through means of natural selection, but the belief of panspermia, which literally translates as seeds everywhere. That, like the Prometheus movies failed to illustrate properly, the mindset that we were planted here by foreign alien life, that our origin was the intelligent will of anything and everything other than God. The purpose of this is unknown. That would be left to the aliens themselves. The cause of this, ironically enough, would be intelligent intervention, but they would argue it's technology, not supernatural. And the best example of this in modern understanding would be like invasive species, which we also note, say, for example, every time it's been practiced in Australia, never actually helps the environment. But nonetheless, the idea and mindset that we came here through intentional, intelligent forces that specifically engineered or allowed for this environment to accommodate us that we grew into is different from abiogenesis, macroevolution through means of natural selection, because you're introducing a different origin, a different cause, a different purpose, and of course the examples of this being illustrated aren't the same. Something that's engineered and something that came by chance and no cause through means of natural selection, as opposed to intentionally encoded development processes that theistic evolutionists would have no problem admitting God would introduce into us, is the same mindset, because that could be another version of evolution. That the belief that God used change within or even across species, even though we have no evidence for that yet, is again determined based off of whether or not this God, it doesn't have to be the Christian God, but the mindset that these sort of things were introduced by an intelligent force beyond nature. The cause, of course, is explained in God. And the best example of this among Christian circles is circulating in what's known as the gap theory. The idea that there's an undeterminate period of time between God's introduction of the universe and the arrival of mankind and the earth we know it as it is today. But nevertheless, there's also things we do have evidence for, things like microevolution, as opposed to, I mentioned before, macroevolution on the large scale and explanation of all species. There is also within a species evidence of change. The origin of this isn't relevant to the conversation. The purpose, again, can flow from survival. That's why they would specify microevolution through means of natural selection. They could also note by means of speciation, by means of environmental and structural adaptation, things that we actually have evidence for, where we would note the difference between certain species of dogs and cats based on their environment, having thicker or less fur, having certain features that would be keen to their environments and food sources. We could note Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, that microevolution can in fact be a observable feature and experience, that nature does in fact endure, that something is well designed even in a broken state. And of course, the best example of this, as I mentioned, is in the biodiversity within species. But notice microevolution through whatever means is not the same thing as macroevolution through specific means and with a specific and unscientific origin. We also need to note as well that when we're talking about structural adaptation, that in of itself can be a term used as evolution, but interchangeably with things that have no affiliation apart from the concept of change. The origin, again, of structural adaptation, the idea of based on environments, food sources, and so forth, they can, in fact, change. The origin of this isn't specified or relevant to the study. The purpose, though, is with the environments in mind, not for the production of new species, not an uncaused phenomena that just randomly happens by chance, but specifically because of external factors. Notice the difference between what's being argued in the first atheist version and the one we actually have evidence for and can acknowledge completely in line with a biblical worldview. Biodiversity would also be an example of this, since the cause is, again, biological. It's within species. Dogs remain dogs, cats remain cats. Animals within their kinds, to to use the Genesis term, remain those kinds. But this is the issue, because when you encounter the infamous fallacy of equivocation, not to mention appeal to authority or anything else, we call it a failure to get the math right in terms of the argument, because the evidence is required to argue in favor of what to prove about abiogenesis, macroevolution through means of natural selection is a long name because there's a lot to prove there, are all centered around the mindset of the atheist, not needing to be accountable to anything like evidence or proof, since they can default to their authorities in science to, I suppose just say that these things are the case, and any gaps in their knowledge, as we've discussed before, can be handed off to another field. And then that field, when discussing those issues, has shown gaps in their information, they hand it off to another field until you forget what the conversation is about. It's the same phenomena when you see the argument being made to extend these conversations needlessly, to have much ado about nothing in terms of, oh, look at the homogeneous and features of these skeletons and so forth, when the reality is you're showing me 3 different animals, none of which can actually transform into the other, and we need actual evidence of lifetimes upon lifetimes of those unique types of species that not only settled into their mutations, which is not possible, but also, interestingly enough, were able to pass on these genes despite being hybrids or transitional forms, which again also has not been observed. So, understand first and foremost what they mean matters, and you need to be able to call them out on this, and hopefully by this point you can already tell that they're playing fast and loose with terms. In order to prove something with evidence that certainly verifies microevolution, they would say any evidence for any kind of evolution proves every kind, when they are all based off of a different explanation of our origins, purpose, cause, and would be set in real life through very different examples, very different definitions, very different evidence in order to prove them. And the best way to understand this is, again, to put ourselves in their shoes. If I were to argue as a Christian for the authority of Scripture, I need to actually stick to the text as to what I'm trying to prove and provide evidence relevant to the text in order to verify that. If, on the other hand, I were to jump around and say anything that proves Christianity is 100% irrefutable proof of the Bible, I would be deceptive and unclear in that kind of handling of evidence. If I say, well, I have this personal experience with God, and therefore that proves whether or not the historical documentation around the 400-year period of time in the book of Judges is accurate. Well, if I wanted to prove something taking place in the book of Judges, I'd want archaeological evidence in the region of Israel, then known as Canaan. I'd want to see the kind of idolatrous practices that were taking place in those areas, both in and outside of the Jewish culture. I'd want to see maybe other nations talking about this being an unstable area with a lot of infighting, and perhaps even mention of the names of the nations that existed during this time, but not after this time, since they were wiped out. That would be relevant evidence. But if I were to then argue something emotional, something social, something totally removed from the topic of the Bible and history, 2 very distinct categories, I wouldn't be proving anything, because while my experiences may be valid, proof of Christianity isn't necessarily proof of the Bible, since, of course, and I'm not saying that if Christianity is true, the Bible's not true. I'm saying that we need to stick to categories. The atheist would be right in calling us out on that. So if I argue, okay, I'm going to argue for macroevolution. Here's an example of microevolution. Change within a species. That proves that you can change from one species to another. Not proving anything. It's foundational to the conversation and argument. Be aware of these things. The second question we need to ask when talking to people, hopefully having gotten this far, is to understand what reasons do they have to believe evolution as they define it as true. the first and most important thing to understand is that when you're dealing with atheists, especially in terms of their reasons for believing something, it's not because of the individual facts that present themselves as reason to conclude these things are true, but the fact is Christians on the creationist side would use the same evidence in order to prove that their conclusions are true. The issue is in worldviews. The allowance of certain concepts, like an intelligent designer, or like the absence of it and the absolute nature of the natural, is the first to be aware of. Naturalism, the belief that there is only in existence the things that pertain to the five senses, except for the concept of naturalism. That's something that universally describes things that are above nature, which exists, but doesn't, according to itself. Another is what's called nihilism, and there are non-nihilistic atheists, but it's essentially a worldview that only views things in terms of where it's inevitably going. If you've seen the Super Mario movies, you know that the nihilistic blue star Luma Lee, which was my favorite character, by the way. I never thought I'd be seeing a Luma character from Nintendo quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, but I digress. The mindset of someone arguing in terms of when you die, you're done, that kind of mindset, there is no afterlife, often pairs with naturalism, but is also something to consider because in the study of and examining of death, if that's where the conversation ends, then, of course, you being sensitive to that would mean I know what else I need to prove to this person before the conversation starts. Another one is that their worldview hinges, turns, bases its foundations on life arising from non-life. Obviously, the illustrations can be infinite, but the mindset of something organic coming from inorganic matter, something being produced that is living, something functional coming from something that is non-functional without any intelligent outside intervention, that time and chance will cause all things. That, of course, is shockingly unscientific, since, of course, you need intelligent observation to form the conclusion and hypothesis. But that, along with uncaused effects, is what would, ironically enough, put any worldview in the macroevolution, in the abiogenesis category, through means of natural selection that the majority of atheists espouse, are all centered on claiming an uncaused effect is the foundation of life itself, while they are using their life in order to claim it in line with science, the study of cause and effect, which is built on uncaused effects. Let me know if you see the problem. But this is where it ultimately comes down to, is that just like there are Christians that will default to their pastor, the atheist will default to their priests in white lab coats and say, because they are more educated than you on terms like biology, paleontology, astronomy, and the like, you can likewise argue, well, you are unable to give me anything meaningful in terms of or in conversations about God, since my pastors and Bible scholars are more informed about theology and biblical history than you. That's an appeal to authority. Just because someone is, again, educated or experienced in a field does not preclude them from being wrong. And the point being made is this. Naturalism, and just going through these all one by one, is a fundamentally incoherent worldview because you need to use a purposely determined brain to determine your purpose and trust its conclusions, despite these conclusions not having anything to do with the motivating drive of what they're trying to prove is the governing factor of all things, survival and propagation of the species. Understanding concepts like our origin and ethics have nothing to do. In fact, in many ways, they impede it with our survival. Nihilism likewise causes or creates, according to the people who espoused it, a moral vacuum that allows for any opinion to ultimately justify itself. Where in this purposeless universe is it required, dare I say, for scientists to be honest about what they've discovered or determined? And we'll get into that. we're all headed to the heat death of the universe, so basing your understanding of everything is on a lie isn't relevant since it's heading the same direction anyway. It doesn't actually motivate or create the kind of worldview they believe it's creating for them. That I'm put a step above the religious superstitions, this is the atheist argument, because I espouse irrelevant data to something that wouldn't make a difference in what we're actually here for and to do. And even if I accomplish those feats, it's all going to head the same direction anyway if we were established as a theocracy and deluded into believing in all these false gods. The universe wouldn't care anyway. The point is that this moral ought isn't answered by atheism or evolution, yet they claim that it establishes their worldview. We also note that, as I mentioned before, appealing to authority usually is an accusation made against Christians for trusting the Bible, their church, their teacher. But when the pro-evolution crowd blindly trust the science, when it's actually the opinions or the authority of the scientist, suddenly it's fine because it's not something you're trained to make fun of online. It's dumb to trust someone blindly. And it's even worse when the people you're trusting also blindly trust others to cover the gaps in their fields. It's just as dumb when non-religious people do it as when religious people do. And this call for consistency would address about 90% of the fruitless conversations and propaganda that you will hear from atheists, especially on the internet. Best example of this is the discovery of fine tissue in dinosaur bones. The conclusion isn't that the bones would have to be much earlier than millions of years, as proposed by the National Geographic and the BBC. The paleontologist that found collagen and marrow in a Tyrannosaurus hip bone trusted the claims of biologists who said there was a way for the tissue to last that long. Why? Not because of any actual biological principle, but the biologist who deferred to the paleontologist is now deferring to the geologist. And when the geologist is asked what would cause this preservation over millions of years, when the tissue itself couldn't have lasted more than 1,000, they defer to the historian who is certain when dinosaurs all died out. How is he certain? Well, he defers to the metaphysician, and so on and so on. It doesn't actually get anywhere. And if this is the way that any worldview apart from the atheist would function, they would be the first to point it out and mock it. But because they are only trained in one direction, the buzzwords aren't communicated and the IQ points aren't exactly clicking. But if, on the other hand, we take a step back and note, consistency is king. I want to know if I have a bad idea or a bad way of handling even true information, because such a thing is possible. Likewise, you can find experts in spinning and weaving lies and making them accessible to large groups of people. Doesn't make it any less false. We need to be willing to actually address things on the basis of what we understand. And if someone has actually taken the time to think through their worldview, not parrot what they heard from someone else, then you can have a meaningful conversation and hopefully both learn from each other. Such a thing is possible. I've learned many productive things from atheist writers, but the emphasis is once again not on falling for this mindset of this scientist said it definitively. Why? Because they deferred to another scientist who said this definitively. Why? Because they said this deferred to this scientist who said it definitively. Why? Because they defer. You never actually get to the foundation of the conversation. What's actually being dealt with as far as what's right in front of you. And ultimately it's just trying to be explained away. And this is where we also get down to the other problem, because on top of unintentionally lying, misrepresenting the data because of your worldview, letting, remember this word, bias, fill in the gaps as far as finding something contrary to your worldview and explaining it away. Well, you have to ask another question, because if you're trusting these people, has that trust ever been violated? Are there examples of dishonesty or even outright fraud in the promotion of the specific brand of evolution that they themselves espouse to? Because again, remember that character is proven, not assumed. If you prove your character through your education, but then use that education as a field to outright lie about things in order to provide evidence for them, then you have undermined your credibility as well as the topics you're failing to prove reflect reality. That's not the truth. We have 3 examples that we've discussed before. Obviously, when it comes to our origins, when it comes to fossil records, and even when it comes to their presentation of the data. Any number of these would have more than one instance, but because we're running out of time, I'll be brief. Ernst Haeckel's embryos. I was actually taught this in my college courses. Oddly enough, the course was on water conservation and graduate level environmental biology, handy stuff when you live in the desert. But essentially it was a chart that was all showing developing embryos that looked exactly the same until a certain point of development. This was used as evidence for common descent, that all organisms share a common ancestor. The reality was that these weren't actual pictures of embryos. They were drawings by Haeckel that was claiming that's what they looked like. And despite the verifiable fraud, they still have this in science textbooks today. And even the atheist and pagan students were pointing out to the professor, you know this is false, right? And he says, yeah, but it's in the book, so just write it down and move on. Another famous one, and this is true of many fossil presentations, but this one I think is the most to the point, Piltdown Man, Piltdown man. This was the first argued transitional form between man and ape through the discovery of a piece of a jaw, a tooth, and part of its skull. This was publicized through the daily newspaper to announce the vital evidence proving macroevolution in 1912. Now, that, of course, gave Christians a run for their money. Look at this right here. We have verifiable proof. The problem was that in 1953, so that would be a full 41 years later, it was finally but quietly acknowledged that the group of British scientists actually painted the bones to make them look older, lied about their testing data, and even filed down the teeth in order to make them look more human. The same thing happened with Nebraska Man in 1922 when they used a single tooth to determine as irrefutable evidence that macroevolution is true and the creation myth is a lie, till they finally admitted it was a pig's tooth. And this, once again, showed no transitional forms between man and ape. We can talk about Lucy, where on camera they filed down the hip bone to make it fit into something that wasn't even a part of the same skeleton. And we also have the ongoing evidence of even dinosaur fossils, where they are editing and fabricating these sort of things in order to make these kind of arguments. I'll mention more as we go on. But notice that this is not something new as far as a lack of credibility in this community. And none, I think, better than those who are popularizing it. National Geographic in the year 2000, they commissioned artists, not scientists, artists, to portray what a missing link female would have looked like after they sent the different illustrators, not the paleontologists, not the biologists, not even the historians, artists, boxes with bones, usually a set of 6 bones, which was the same method, by the way, that was used to determine what dinosaurs would have looked like, while using whale and horse bones as inspiration, which is all well and good for science fiction and maybe monster movie design, but the fact is that Nat Geo put these forward as the claims of historians and scientists regarding what they look like, yet the only people involved in this were the artists. The ambulocetus being the transitional form, for example, between what whales and horses were, or the March 2000 edition of Nat Geo, which shows these proto-hominid forms, are still in circulation today around the world. They are not retracted, even though they are fraudulent, and this is not the half of it. We have old and new, admitted and unapologized for, blatant and underhanded examples of macroevolution evidence that shows a nihilistic worldview does in fact matter when you are considering, is honesty really a priority? Not in this community. Note, we're not arguing that theists never lie, or make bad arguments about the concept of God. Muslims and pagans do it all the time as a virtue in their religion. Christians who compromise are held accountable for it. Yet the topic of conversation is, once again, not about whether or not Christians are doing these things, but the infallibility of atheist scientists who universally believe evolution when even that isn't true. And the evidence is categorically laughable if criticism wasn't being censored. This is what brings us to the fourth question. What has to be true in order to conclusively believe that abiogenesis, macroevolution, through means of natural selection, the atheist brand of our origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, is true? Well, as mentioned before, speculation and just so arguments don't work for either of us. So just saying God did it is just as foolish as saying evolution did it without any evidence to reflect that. Christians and other theists can reject the specific form of evolution because of the evidence in our favor regarding intelligent design and objectivity regarding the data, but if they want to argue with the data, this is what we actually need to be asking for. The first is that we need a single, making it real difficult, a single example of one species transitioning to another. We need a single example of a hybrid species being born with the capacity to reproduce. We need millions upon millions of fossils demonstrating the transition from one species into another over time without intelligent intervention. And note, not this looks similar to this despite being in totally different biological categories. We need the whole line, generation by generation, of showing this became this, became this, became this, and into that. That's what Darwin was looking for and hoped that they would find in time, and we still haven't to this day. We need a scientific basis to reject the concept of irreducible complexity within established living organisms. Fraudulent claims like, of course, biological scaffolding were made up out of nothing, but the mindset needs to be ultimately condemned, because if irreducible complexity is a reality, then you need all of those things in order to have life in the first place. It's not, oh, this non-matter could become matter if given enough time and chance. All of these things need to be in place before you even have one thing that we could even call life. We also need a documented example of a form of life that would function without everything we already see in living organisms. No, not just the concept, a scientific basis to reject irreducible complexity. We need an actual example of something functioning as a living organism, not having pieces of living matter, but actually functioning without all of the things we see as necessary to function in biological life today. We also need a philosophical basis to argue uncaused effects in a field that examines cause and effect. When they figure out how to find out how to reconcile that contradiction, we'll have discovered a square circle. And we also need a mathematical justification to reject Borel's law of probability, which states that any probability higher than 1 in 10 with 50 zeros after it is entirely theoretical and not possible in real life, since, of course, the odds for anything, even one of the proteins being formed that make the basic building blocks of life that we observe them today, which abiogenesis is arguing is already assumed and happening, goes past this by hundreds of zeros, and it's not even funny. So, this is where then we have to ask the question, do you have answers for these things? What do we actually have to prove that the specific brand of atheism that argues evolution is proof that it's scientifically conclusive and valid? Well, let's start with the issue of a single example of one species transitioning to another. The reality is, no transitional forms that aren't revealed to either be fraud or fabricated exist. Even their claims of whale hip bones being vestigial and their brains having the capacity to process light that is useless in deep ocean water, they shoot themselves in the foot when falsely claiming, say for example, that the original whales were Pakicetus, which is again referring to the whale of Pakistan, which that became aquatic in certain environments over time. They said that this fossil was claimed to be a whale because the person who discovered it said so. The reality was it was just a shard of a lower jaw. He thought it was comparable to whales and jumped to a massive conclusion with the shard of a lower jaw, forming a drawing himself. So National Geographic weren't the first people to do this, of drawing its arms, legs, hip, back, and tail structure, showing a transitional form from this into a whale. Then, when the whole animal was actually found, his drawing was nothing comparable, and it turned out just to be a type of ancient pig. Noting as well the issue that we have with a hybrid species being born to reproduce, no reproduction means the mutation that could, in fact, add data to its genetic structure, which is never what happens. Mutations remove genetic structure, doesn't get passed on and develops into a new species with hundreds of millions of new mutations to form without a single one of these unique mutations killing the whole genetic line. Hybrids, by definition, are sterile. You need evidence to show to the contrary, that outside of its species, or even within its species, that this biodiversity that is necessary to argue this form of evolution can in fact produce a new kind of species, when even diversity within the kinds is incredibly risky, that what they're asking for is simply biologically impossible, or should I say unscientific. Regarding the fossil record, let's once again note that we have none demonstrating every single generation that would be necessary to prove the actual transition of one species to another, which is, of course, either through disproven speculation or claimed to be homologous through fraud. We note and have to remind them again that irreducible complexity is still a thing. The only places they reject it is in science fiction novels. We have everything we need to survive, and anything less would mean less survival. Their argument and worldview that this is the driving force is what they're using to argue against it. And even then, the concept of vestigial or needless, useless organs are also out, because things like our appendix or gallbladder, for example, have been discovered to have purposes. Just because you can live without something doesn't mean that it's fundamentally useless. I can live without my arm. I'd like it for survival situations as much as human flourishing. We also need to note as well, there is no reason they have to set these bases for being suddenly useless, because they were there for our previous lifetimes and were introduced without a thought. Our appendix does serve a role in our immune system. The problem is our fatty diets made it very difficult for them to process things at the rate that we're feeding them with. We also need to note as well that the philosophy is not in their favor either, because science is about observation. Evolution, in its modern form, is about speculation and just so theories wrapped up in long conversations that don't actually prove anything. And we also need to note as well that, as we talked about with probability, time and chance cause nothing. The law of atrophy in nature is universal. Energy is running out. Nature, left to its devices, causes disorder, not order. Explosions in printing shops don't produce encyclopedias. Tornadoes running through junkyards don't build a 747 jet. Name your illustration. That's the point. Which will bring us to the last question. What is the real reason that atheists argue evolution as if it's proof of their worldview being true? Well, like Charles Darwin and Thomas Huxley before them, our emotions, desires, and social pressures have more of an influence on us than we want to admit. Huxley himself, who was nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog, by the way, said that his reason for believing evolution wasn't because of the data, it was because it allowed him to exercise his sexual desires freely. Objective. Darwin's evolution theory also isn't what produced his atheism. He became an atheist 8 years before his journey to the Galapagos Islands when his daughter died of tuberculosis. Here's the actual issues. They are reasons, but follow the evidence, and intellectualism aren't the reason. They are not listed. The first reason people want evolution to be true is often because of social influence. My father is one of them. He was an atheist before he became a Christian, not because he had studied all the data as an 8-year-old, but because he loved my grandfather, his father, and he didn't believe in God. So to say that God was a real thing was to disrespect and dishonor his dad, and he had more respect for his dad, his social circle, than he did for anyone who spoke contrary to his worldview. It motivated very passionate objections towards Christianity, but it wasn't based on intellectualism, and they need to know that. We note moral influence, like we talked about with Thomas Huxley. There's things they are doing in their life that evolution and the absence of God accommodate. This isn't always the case, but it is, in fact, relevant to conversations about this. When people are very passionate in opposition to God, it's not because there's actual data in their favor. It's because there's an activity they are very passionate in wanting to continue doing, and they don't want to allow for anything to stand in the way of that. And it doesn't always have to be the pursuit of pleasure. It can be the pursuit of power. It can be the pursuit of anything. But the motivation is entirely based on the senses, not based on the actual data. And lastly, that of emotional influence, that when people interact with other people, bad things can happen. When those people are Christians and they do bad things to others, that leaves an impression on people that makes them want to repel from any association with that particular group, which, while not intellectual and not necessarily fair, is understandable. The majority of the most active of the new atheists are that way because they had previous examples of Christianity in their early childhoods, an abusive schoolmaster, a communist child molester, on and on it goes. All people who they associate with Christianity, despite acting contrary to Jesus, and saying that speaks for all Christianity, therefore I want nothing to do with them. I myself understand this completely. When, say, for example, I have negative experiences with members my previous life, just people I've interacted with that I really didn't like and certainly had no reason to like. I also was aware they are fans of airplanes. Well, I, if you know, have no love or affiliation with aerospace and the laws of ascent. I'm not a fan of jets, airplanes, or even collecting those things. I like military stuff, but you'll be shocked to see that not a lot of my armies have any air superiority. And the reason for that isn't because necessarily I'm against the Air Force. It's because, or even that I'm afraid of flying. I don't care about that. It's because I want to avoid any association with negative people who also have association with those things in my life. And the point is just that. When they're arguing for and mulling over all of these articles and so forth, quoting things that even they couldn't spell unaided, would be reason to believe this person really has dug into the intellectual aspect of this belief. The answer is simply not. They are investing this passion because they're willing to throw any and every obstacle between them and those who have hurt them in their past. And that's going to require patience. That's going to require God to soften some hearts, but it's not going to require you to waste more time than what's necessary and what God's calling you to do when it ultimately comes down to it. And also note as well that it doesn't mean it's necessarily your fault if they throw back this information in your face, exchange a few words of profanity, and move on with their day. You didn't do anything wrong. But the emphasis needs to be understood that there's a trend in history, not just of fraud and deception among the atheist community and the pro-evolution crowd, not just a trend of worldviews that ultimately are self-defeating in their belief systems, not just instances of moral compromise as the motivation for their moral ethics and then functioning as parasites to rob Christianity of its status as what it is by definition and then claiming that we can be good without God. All of this is moot to the point, however, because when the actual conversation of today's topic is being brought up to say, you Christians don't believe in evolution, therefore you should become an atheist because atheists are the only ones that believe in this form of evolution. Once again, I believe in evolution, not abiogenesis macroevolution, but I do in fact know that my Rhodesian Ridgeback Patty is very different from my mother-in-law's Chihuahua Wallace. I do in fact understand there's a difference between both while they're being recognized as dogs. One is adapted to a desert environment, the other adapted more for hunting purposes, and we enjoy the energy, presence, and size of all of them. But the point being made is I don't automatically infer and conclude that that difference, evolution, microevolution, macroevolution, panspermia, structural adaptation, etc., that those all mean the same thing. There are people who, of course, argue the old earth creation account and somehow are still Christians. It's almost as if atheism isn't a monopoly on these things. There are those who believe in theistic evolution, that like the panspermia theory, that God is the alien intelligent force, that even Richard Dawkins would agree with the basic premises of, in terms of explaining our origins and how we got from there to where we are today. But that's not the point. It's ultimately stemming from the actual issue, that atheism is just one more excuse, or evolution, is just one more excuse that atheists use to put a barrier between themselves and God. And when it ultimately comes down to it, you're not accountable for them being unreasonable. Your goal is, will you be the reasonable one or not? That's all I really think I need to say, and we've still got a few more seconds. So we do have a question here on our YouTube page. Sincere or not, it's really relevant. It's from Nick. Wants to know, if I cuss, will I go to hell if I cuss? No, you will not go to hell if you cuss. The only thing that is going to send you to hell isn't your use of language in a negative sense, but your decision to receive mercy from Jesus in a positive sense. Read Romans chapter 10, verses 9 through 10. You won't hear any note about foul language in that. The reason why Christians generally are against foul language or cussing, referencing needlessly vulgar references or things that elicit an emotional negative reaction from people, is because one of the defining sources of our ethics in the Bible, in the book of Ephesians as well as Paul's other letters, says that no coarse language, crude jesting, Colossians uses this specific term, should come out of our mouths, because Jesus himself said, out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speak. It's not that you will go to hell for it, it's that it's unfitting for someone who claims to have a relationship with Jesus. God bless you. We'll see you all again tomorrow. Thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing your questions this week.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.